I never told my son what was inside the safety deposit box at the credit union on Portage Avenue. He knew I had one. He'd seen me mention it once, years ago, when I was updating my will after his mother passed. But I never told him what was in it, and I never explained why. At the time, he didn't ask. He was 26 and grieving, and had enough to carry without me adding to it. That was 4 years ago. My name isn't important. What matters is that I'm 61 years old. I spent 32 years working for the city of Winnipeg in infrastructure planning, and I raised my son alone after his mother, Diane, died of a brain aneurysm on a Tuesday morning in March. She was 53. She'd made oatmeal for breakfast and was pouring her second cup of coffee when it happened. By the time the ambulance arrived, she was already gone. Grief does strange things to a family. It can pull people together, or it can leave gaps that the wrong people fill. My son's name is Callum. He's 30 now, tall like me, quieter than I ever was. He works in logistics for a freight company out of Street James. He's responsible, dependable, careful with money, everything I tried to raise him to be. I was proud of him. I still am, even after everything. Pride doesn't disappear just because you're angry. He met Renata at a work function in the spring 2 years ago. She was there with a friend, not connected to his company, and Callum called me that same evening, which he almost never does. That alone told me something. He sounded lighter than I'd heard him in years. I was glad. He deserved that. I met her 6 weeks later at a Sunday dinner at my house. She was attractive, well-dressed, laughed easily. She called me Mr. Ashworth and complimented my pot roast, which I'd been making the same way since 1987. I noticed she didn't offer to help clear the table. I told myself that didn't mean anything. Lots of people don't. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was one of those fathers who would never think any woman was good enough for his son. I didn't want to be that man, so I said nothing. I watched. I waited. The engagement came 8 months after they met. I found out because Callum posted a photo on Facebook before he called me. The photo had 47 comments in the first hour. My comment was the 43rd. I didn't say anything about that either. The wedding planning started immediately. I mean, immediately within days. Renata had a binder. I know this because Callum mentioned it, laughing, like it was endearing. Maybe it was. But the numbers that came out of that binder were not endearing. The venue she wanted held 320 guests and was a restored heritage building in the Exchange District. The catering, quote, alone was $22,000. She wanted a florist from Toronto flown in because, as Callum relayed to me with an apologetic shrug, the local options weren't quite right. I asked Callum what his contribution to the wedding budget was. He said they were splitting it, but Renata's parents weren't in a position to help much, so it would mostly fall to him. I asked him how much he had saved. He looked at the floor. I didn't push, but I sat with that information. What I hadn't told Callum, what I hadn't told anyone, was that in the 18 months after Diane died, once the shock settled and I started thinking clearly again, I'd restructured everything. The house was paid off long before she passed, but I'd also been quietly building something else for years. A separate account, investment holdings. Diane and I had started together in our 40s, mostly ETFs and some REIT positions that had grown quietly and consistently. I'd also inherited a small amount from her parents, which I rolled into the same pool rather than spending it. None of this was hidden in any dishonest sense. It was simply private. It was mine and Diane's, and after she was gone, it was mine alone, and I didn't see why it needed to be anyone else's business. I updated my will 2 months after the engagement announcement. My lawyer, a practical woman named Patricia, who has been handling my affairs for 15 years, I kept that appointment to myself. I also, quietly, moved the core documents, the investment statements, the updated will, the property deed, 2 letters I'd written to Callum that I wanted him to read only after I was gone from the filing cabinet in my office to the safety deposit box at the credit union. I upgraded the box to a larger size. I paid the annual fee in cash, from my checking account, which nobody monitored but me. Callum got married on a Saturday in September. The ceremony was beautiful. Diane would have cried through all of it. I sat in the front row and held it together because that's what I do. And I danced with Renata at the reception and told her she looked lovely, which was true. I meant it. The reception cost what I suspected it would cost. What changed afterward was gradual at first. The calls from Callum became shorter. When I did see him, Sunday dinners that became bi-weekly, then monthly, Renata was usually there, and the conversation had a different quality to it. Polite, surface level, like we were doing an impression of a close family rather than being one. The first time she brought up money directly was 4 months after the wedding. We were sitting in their living room, and Callum had stepped out to take a work call. Renata set down her wine glass and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as calculated warmth. She said she hoped I didn't mind her asking, but she and Callum were thinking about the future, about whether they might eventually want to put down roots somewhere, maybe purchase a larger property. She said she knew I'd spent my career in city planning and probably understood real estate better than most. She wondered if I'd thought about how I might want to structure things, estate-wise, so that Callum could benefit sooner rather than later. I looked at her for a moment. I said that I appreciated her thinking ahead. I said my affairs were in order and Callum would be well taken care of when the time came. She smiled and said that was wonderful. Then she said, gently, that sometimes it made more sense to transfer assets while everyone was still alive and healthy, that estate taxes could be complicated, that it might be worth a conversation with a financial planner she had a contact, if I was interested. I said I had my own advisors, thank you. Callum came back in and the conversation shifted, but it didn't leave me. That winter, the questions became less subtle. Renata asked Callum to ask me, which Callum did with visible discomfort, whether I owned any other property besides the house. She'd heard me mention a credit union once, apparently, and wondered if that was where I kept savings. Callum apologized before and after asking. I told him my finances were private, that he'd know everything he needed to know when the time was appropriate, and that I loved him. He said he understood. I don't think Renata did. In February, I got a call from my neighbor Bud, who is 74 and retired and home most of the day. He called to tell me that a woman matching Renata's description, he'd met her twice at the house, had been parked outside my house for 45 minutes that morning, engine running. When he went to his front window again, the car was gone. I thanked him. I didn't mention it to Callum. In March, I was in Thunder Bay for a long weekend, visiting my brother Hugh. He's older than me, retired from teaching, lives near the lake, and we make a point of seeing each other a few times a year. I was there Friday through Monday. On Saturday morning, my phone rang. It was Callum, and before he said anything, I could hear that something was wrong. He sounded wound tight, like he was trying to stay calm and not quite managing it. He said, Dad, I need to tell you something. Renata found some papers in your office. I said, I'm sorry? He said she'd been at my house. He'd given her a spare key months ago, he said, so she could drop something off when I was out. She'd let herself in and found the filing cabinet in my office unlocked. I keep the one in the office unlocked because it only has utility records and old tax returns, and she'd gone through the files looking for, in Callum's careful phrasing, a sense of the overall picture. She hadn't found investment documents, because those weren't there. But she'd found a card from the credit union with the safety deposit box information on it. The box number. The branch address. That morning, while I was sitting in my brother's kitchen eating scrambled eggs, Renata had gone to the branch on Portage Avenue and told a customer service representative that she was my daughter-in-law and needed access to the box. When she was told that only the registered holder could access it, she asked what it would take to add a second name. When she was told that the account holder would need to be present and consent in writing, she'd apparently stood at the counter for a long time before leaving. Then she'd gone back to my house and examined the exterior of the deadbolt, Callum told me, and had been on the phone with a locksmith. Callum had found this out because the locksmith had called him by mistake. They had his number on file from a time he'd arranged emergency service at their old apartment, the same last name, and the locksmith left a voicemail confirming the appointment for that afternoon. Callum had called her, and she'd hung up. Then she'd called him back and told him this was about protecting their future, that I was clearly hiding assets that would affect their financial planning, and that she had a right to know. I sat in my brother's kitchen and listened to my son tell me this. Hugh watched me from across the table and didn't say a word. When Callum finished, I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, call the locksmith and cancel the appointment. Tell them there's been a misunderstanding. He said, Dad, I said, I'm not angry with you. Cancel the appointment and then go home. And I'll call you when I'm back. There was a pause. He said, okay. I hung up and sat there for a little while. Hugh poured more coffee into my cup without asking. He said, bad? I said, could be worse. He said, what are you going to do? I told him I'd already done most of it. I came home Monday evening. I called my lawyer Tuesday morning. The safety deposit box was already properly secured. The credit union had flagged the access attempt and left a note on the account, which I'd requested in advance, as a precaution some months earlier when I'd first started to feel uneasy. Nothing had been breached. The documents were intact. I asked my lawyer to draw up a formal record of the account attempt for my own files and to send a brief, factual letter to Callum and Renata's address, confirming that any access to my accounts, property, or estate documents, without my explicit written consent, would constitute a legal matter. She wrote it plainly, without drama. It was 2 paragraphs. It said everything it needed to. That Thursday, I asked Callum to come for dinner. Just him. He arrived, looking like he hadn't slept. He sat at the kitchen table where he'd eaten breakfast as a teenager and looked at his hands. I put a bowl of soup in front of him because he looked cold, even though it wasn't cold outside. I sat across from him and I said, I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to just listen until I'm finished. He nodded. I told him about the investment accounts. I told him what they were worth, approximately. I told him about the updated will, what it said, and why I'd structured it the way I had. I told him about the letters I'd written, one that was practical, about finances and property, and who to call when I was gone, and one that was personal, the kind of letter you write to someone you love and don't always say enough to out loud. I told him that none of this was ever hidden from him in a way that was meant to hurt him. It was private. It was mine and his mother's, and I hadn't been ready to share it, and I hadn't needed to yet. He was healthy, and I was healthy, and there was no urgency except the urgency someone else had created. I told him that his mother had left a letter, too, in the box. She'd written it during the last year of her life, though neither of us knew then that it was the last year. She'd written it one afternoon when I was at work and left it with the documents because she said she wanted to say things she couldn't figure out how to say to his face. He was 26. She knew he struggled to receive that kind of directness from her. Callum hadn't said anything. His soup was going cold. I said, the box isn't about money. It never was. He looked up. I said, when you're ready to read her letter, I'll take you there myself. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, quietly, she left me a letter? I said yes. He put his hands over his face and sat like that for a while. I let him. I got up and heated his soup back up and set it in front of him again and sat back down. We stayed at that table for 2 more hours. We talked about his mother in a way we hadn't since the first year after she died. The small things, the things you forget and then suddenly remember. The way she always burned the toast a little on purpose because she said she liked the crisp. The collection of ceramic birds she kept on the windowsill that I still haven't moved. The way she'd fallen asleep at the end of every movie they ever watched together, without exception, and then argued the next morning that she hadn't. We talked about his marriage. He did most of the talking on that part. I mostly listened. He didn't ask me what he should do, and I didn't tell him. What I will say is this. 3 months later, Callum called to tell me that he and Renata were separating. He said it calmly. And when I asked how he was, he said he was okay, that he'd been thinking for a while, that some things had become clear to him. I didn't ask for details. I told him he could come for dinner any time. I told him he didn't have to call ahead. On a Saturday in November, I drove him to the credit union on Portage Avenue. We sat across from each other at a small table in the private room they use for deposit box access. I put the key on the table and pushed it toward him. He picked it up, looked at it, set it down again. He said, "Can I ask you something first?" I said yes. He said, "Did you know about her before the wedding?" I thought about it honestly. I said I'd had a feeling, that I hadn't been certain, that I hadn't felt it was my place to say something that would have sounded like a father who just couldn't let go. He was quiet. I said, I should have said something. I don't know if it would have changed anything, but I should have tried. He shook his head a little. He said, "Maybe I wouldn't have listened." I said, "Maybe not, but I still should have tried." He picked up the key again and turned it over in his palm. Then he looked at me and said, "She wrote me a whole letter?" I said, "She wrote you 4 pages. I haven't read it. I don't know what it says." He nodded. He stood up. He said, "Okay." We went to the box together. There are things in that room I won't describe in detail, because they belong to him. But I'll say that I sat beside my son while he read his mother's handwriting for the first time in 4 years, and I watched his face move through things. I recognized the surprise, and then the grief, and then something that looked, slowly, like relief. And I thought about Diane making oatmeal on a Tuesday morning, and how much of what matters most isn't in any account, isn't in any box, isn't in any number I could put on a page. She'd left him 4 pages. At the bottom of the last one, she'd written a single line that he read aloud to me, quietly, without looking up. He said, she wrote, "Take care of your father. He won't ask you to, so you'll have to figure that out yourself." I didn't say anything. He folded the letter carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. We drove home through the city, and I made pot roast the same way I've always made it, and we sat at the table until late, and neither of us talked about money or estates or safety deposit boxes. We talked about her. That's the only thing that was ever really in that box. People ask me sometimes, not often, but occasionally, whether I regret not saying something sooner, whether I should have pulled Callum aside before the wedding and told him what I saw. I've thought about that a lot. I still don't have a clean answer. What I know is this. I spent 32 years watching how cities are built. Infrastructure planning sounds dry, and mostly it is, but the core of it is understanding that what holds things up is rarely what's visible. The support is underground. The decisions that matter are made years before anyone cuts a ribbon or lays a stone. That's not a metaphor I invented to make myself feel better about what I did. It's just how I've always thought about things. You prepare quietly. You build what needs to be built, and then you wait. Renata counted on nobody having prepared. That's what people like her count on, that love makes people careless, that grief softens defenses, that a father who seems ordinary and retired and unremarkable probably hasn't thought 3 steps ahead. She was wrong about that. But I don't say that with any satisfaction, because what she was really wrong about was Callum, and it cost him something real to find that out. That's the part that stays with me, not the access attempt at the credit union, not the locksmith appointment she made in my name. Those things were almost predictable once you saw clearly who she was. What stays with me is that my son sat across from me at my kitchen table looking like he hadn't slept, and I had to tell him the truth about something I should have found a way to say a year earlier. I was careful with my assets. I was less careful with that conversation, and the gap between those two things matters. What I've come to understand slowly, in the way you only understand things that cost you, is that protecting the people you love isn't a single act. It's not one will update or one precautionary letter to a lawyer. It's a practice. It's saying the hard thing out loud even when you're not sure it'll land. It's trusting someone enough to be honest with them, not just organized on their behalf. Callum is a grown man. He would have heard me. Maybe he wouldn't have listened, like he said himself that night. But the listening wasn't really the point. The point was that he would have known I saw it, and he would have known I trusted him enough to say so. The letter Diane left him 4 pages. Her handwriting, the last line she wrote him, that's what I think about when I try to understand what I got right and what I got wrong. She knew she might not always be there to say the things he needed to hear. So she wrote them down and left them somewhere safe, where they'd find him when the time was right. That's a different kind of preparation than anything I did. It's slower and quieter, and it doesn't protect anything except the relationship itself. Callum reads that letter sometimes. He's told me. He doesn't say what's in it, except for that last line, which he's mentioned more than once. She told him to take care of me. She knew he'd need to be told. He comes for dinner most Sundays now. He calls during the week. Last month, he drove me to a physio appointment and sat in the waiting room for an hour without complaining, reading a magazine from 2023. When I came out, he said, "You ready?" And that was it. That's the thing she left him. Not money, not property, not a strategy, just the instinct to show up. I think that's what she was really keeping safe all along.